Hi everybody and welcome to today's ISE webinar. My name's Steve Isherwood. I'm Joint Chief Executive of the ISE. I'll introduce the rest of our panellists shortly, but welcome to today's webinar. If you haven't joined an ISE webinar before, we like to make them as interactive as possible. So you'll see the Q&A function, you'll see the chat function. Please pop any questions in there that you've got for our panellists as we go through. I'll keep an eye on those, and we've got time to we'll have time at the end, definitely sort of 10 minutes or so, where we can cover off any questions that are there. I mean, this is a very big topic. It's a topic for concern for an awful lot of our members. We've got over 300 people registered to join us today, which is that's a big number for an ISE webinar, particularly on a Monday morning in January when everybody's got in. But actually February, that shows how time's going already. We're at February already, when everybody's got very full inboxes at the moment. We'll record it as well, so you will get a recording that will come through on email over the next couple of days or so. If there's anything that you've missed that you want to go back to, of course we'll also put it on our platform, so colleagues, people you work with, etc., who also need an update, please feel free to share with them. So let's get stuck into the body of the conversation. Why don't we do some introductions first? So if we go around my screen as I see it, Alison, would you like to just introduce yourself first?
Sure. So I'm Alison Wells. I'm from BPP Education Group, and I'm a senior director within the group.
Thanks, Alison. Anne-Marie?
Hi, yes, I'm Anne-Marie Graham, and I'm Chief Executive at UKISE, the UK Council for International Student Affairs.
And Georgia.
Hi everyone, Georgia Greer, wearing two hats today. One is my ISE Head of Insights, and the second one is Director of Early Careers for a boutique private bank called Quintet, who focus on European and UK talent.
Thanks very much. So the format of today's webinar is going to be very much panel conversation. So we've got some questions that we've kind of agreed that we think covers the majority of the topic at the moment. But as I said, please use the Q&A to drop your own questions in there as well. And if we can, we will answer them. And I think that if we can is the key thing here, because this is a fluid situation. This is responding to the announcements that were made at the back end of last year by James Cleverly in the Houses of Parliament, which of course raised lots of concerns and issues for members, both in the education space, but also in the employer space. And that's what we want to unpick a little bit of today. I think you're probably all up to speed whereby, in the sense that actually the announcements were made, but there was no detail, and civil servants have been sort of working behind the scenes on that. There are announcements due. And I think there's two things also that we will cover here in the main. One is actually the changes in the rules around visas that are coming down the pipeline this year, but also actually the whole graduate route being put under review by the Migration Advisory Committee. So we'll be talking about that. The issues that have come up in our conversations over the last month or so with all our members on the forums are some of them are getting into quite the technical detail of visas and immigration law. And I think one thing I should say is that none of us on this call are immigration lawyers. So there is a technicality that sometimes you'll need to get to with your own legal counsel, your own legal advice. But the issues broadly as we see them that members are talking about are changes to the cap, what that means. And that has all sorts of implications in terms of when students join you, if you're getting them a full skilled worker visa, what salary level they will need to be brought into the organisation on, whether there'll be a discount to that rate or not. Lots of our members on the surveys we've done bring people in on the skilled worker visa route, not the graduate visa route. And that's largely because they might have programs, and so they want certainty of employment 2, 3, 4 years down the line. We might get into the rules around apprentice programs, of course, because of course those have been impacted this as well. Minimum salaries, and also actually having the length of visa required to do an apprenticing program in its entirety. There are implications for that. So there's a whole raft of different measures that we can go into. So I'm hesitant to not cover off the whole of the content webinar, my summary at the start. So I suggest we get stuck into it now. So Anne-Marie, that's my kind of broad overview of the summary. Would you say that's fairly accurate? And I guess what's the detail beyond that is my first question.
Yeah, I think that is fairly accurate. I mean, I think it's also, more importantly, what's accurate is, is that uncertainty. I think we've had lots of announcement. We've had some things that are being announced. We had some changes to the immigration rules last week. We're still working through what those means, because there are always a little bit of how should we say, inconsistencies to iron out. So uncertainty, I think, is definitely the key word. But I guess what we can be certain about is that, you know, that there is still quite a lot of change to go through this year. So you mentioned, Stephen, obviously that the graduate route is going to be under review. We expect the terms of reference for that review to be published any minute now. I did actually literally just check before I dropped onto this call, because that's how imminent they are. And we're expecting that will be a full review of the route. So I think it's safe to say that in James Cleverly's announcement in December, that it focused on the term misuse or abuse, but actually we think that that's going to go beyond that. In fact, we know that it's going to go beyond that. So I think that is going to be quite a quick review. Initially, we'd anticipated it would publish in September, but that's been brought forward to July, which I think is about as fast as the Mac can work. But it also is indicative of obviously that government is trying to seek some kind of a recommendation or some insight that can inform some, I guess, headline announcements around policy. I think the other thing to be aware of, getting technical, is that we normally would have the student return data from JISC, or formerly ISE, around January every year. And the data we're expecting is for 22-23, which we know is the bumper student recruitment year. Because of changes to JISC's collection model, that's the publication of that is being delayed for 1 year only. So we won't get that data until April this year. And of course, with that will come headline stats around very, very high student numbers, which are now historic. You know, that recruitment is falling. So we know that those numbers are way beyond what will be reported in April. But it's likely that government will respond in some way to those announcements around when the JISC student return is published. So we're trying, as a sector organisation, we're trying to prepare for that and get our messaging right around that, so that we can push back. We'll have a much clearer idea of how recruitment is looking, and I think, you know, that's going to be something that we all need to be aware of for this year at the moment.
Just on that, Anne-Marie,
yeah.
I think our employer members probably aren't aware exactly what that is, those returns. So you can just clarify exactly what they are for those of our members who probably aren't that close to the education world on this.
Sure. So the student return data is every education provider is required, higher education provider is required by JISC to provide data on their student numbers. So it's a full demographic profile of those students that in any institution. So that includes a breakdown for international students as well, whether it's EU, non-EU. And we use, you know, the sector uses that data every year to inform a lot of its work. But more importantly, for your benefit this year, why I'm flagging it here is because we think it's likely that the government will respond to that in perhaps with a knee-jerk policy, or it may be something that we have to counter very, very quickly. So we're trying to get ahead of that now, and we will use the application data that we can feed in from institutions themselves around January intake to give that a bit more of an accurate counter. So that's how it will affect policy, I guess, for you as employers, is that student return data may tell a story, or will definitely tell a story in April, that we know that the more right wing of the party will be very concerned about. I think you may have seen that the MAC published its annual review in December, and we had anticipated that would have a lot in it about the graduate route, and I guess it does, but it's quite revisionist, I would say. But I think there are some clear steers there about what the government needs to think about, what it wants the graduate route to do. I think there's a bit of a disconnect there between how the graduate route and the skilled worker route intersect, and how those changes to the skilled worker threshold are going to impact not on your employers as recruiting through that route, but also for those who are recruiting through the graduate route as well, and how the two are aligned. I think there's also a disconnect in that MAC report about how skilled worker threshold changes perhaps might impact different regions or different sectors. It lacks a little bit of nuance there, and I think that's something that we need to think about very carefully.
There's just a bit of chat going that I can see. Just Anne-Marie on there. Somebody asked what the MAC was, and somebody kindly has beat me to it, typing in the Migration Advisory Committee.
Great.
To say that's who the government goes to, isn't it? In terms of actually, the government aren't bound by what the MAC say, but they use them in terms of advice, research, in terms of thresholds and policy issues on this.
Yeah, and they produce an annual report every year, which looks at all aspects of immigration, and I think was hastily updated to reflect some of James Cleverly's announcements in December. And it does look across the piece. So, for instance, December's one has a review of care workers. It has a review of the skilled worker threshold. It has a reduce the graduate route. Looks at how net migration might be brought down. So that's part of their annual piece. But James Cleverly did also commission them, or make a headline announcement that he was commissioning them to do 2 reviews this year. One is a review of the shortage occupation list, which is ongoing at the moment, and another is a review of the graduate route. And once I finish speaking, I'll post a link to the report in there as well, so people can see that.
Thanks.
I think the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I think that the Migration Advisory Committee will look at how the dependent policy is having an impact. So we will probably feed back on that. We'll submit a formal submission to the graduate route review, and principally we will do that under the umbrella of UKES's International Student Employability Group. And I wanted to touch on that briefly because ISE is a member of that, as are organisations such as the Association of Graduate Careers Advisory Services, the British Council, the British University International Liaison Association. So anyone that's involved in sort of that, telling that story about international student employability, is a member of that group. So we'll be feeding back formally under the umbrella of that group, and I think it's important that we make those connections in that feedback where the dependent policy changes intersect with the graduate route. Thinking about what dependents can bring to the UK labour market as well as the students themselves. Thinking about the downward impact it will have on recruitment and how that may have an impact on the ability to employ international graduates and the availability of international graduates. So I think there's lots of connecting factors there that we need to think about.
Anne-Marie, can I just also make a comment in respect of the dependence change, in that from our position with our students, we're seeing that more female students are being affected because we take a lot of students from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. They're more likely to bring their husband and their family with them. So now they come, they're having to think twice.
Absolutely. I think that we're seeing a definite disproportionate impact on female students and students that required some kind of care or support. They may be disabled, they may have, obviously disabilities cover a wide range of things. So that's our challenge, I think, to the dependent policy. I know that others in the sectors have not pushed back on it, but from a UKESA point of view, it is definitely discriminatory against those groups. I think it also presents problems for, if you think one particular course group that it's presenting real challenges for are MBAs, because they tend to be students that come from a more experienced position. They tend to be more mature with families, established in their careers, and also, their spouses will be mature and established in their careers, will be looking to work as well. So I think there are lots of disproportionate impacts to look at. But I think one of the immediate one that was concern to us was that indeed of female students. I think, that is something. I don't think we're alone in flagging that, but it is a problem, and perhaps something that hasn't been considered quite as fully by the Migration Advisory Committee as it should be.
And what's the relationship, Anne-Marie, of the MAC and setting that salary threshold? Again, do they advise on what that threshold should be to the government, and the government decides whether to accept it or not?
They make recommendations, yeah, and there will be an analysis. They carry out an analysis. There's analysis in the December report, but there'll be more work done on that. But yeah, they have a recommendatory role for the government. So, but they obviously, the tradition is that government do tend to respond to those recommendations, but they don't have to.
And just to recap, because just in case everybody's not quite at the same speed on the webinar, the announcement from James Cleverly was that the salary threshold increased significantly for a skilled worker visa to 38,500, but they've not said yet what the new entrant would be, which is what applies to most of our members, which is that for a new entrant to the labour market, it might be 70-80% of that figure. Is that still where we're at in terms of the situation on this?
That is still where we're at. Yes, we're still waiting for the clarity on that. Yeah, which is keeping quite a lot of people in limbo, obviously. Yeah, and I think you may have seen also there was a little bit of a temporary backtrack on the skilled worker threshold as well at the start of the year, but it is really having an impact. We're already seeing that. I don't need to tell you as employers you're in that position, but obviously we get it from the student end and students and career services contacting us with roles being withdrawn, job offers being withdrawn because we simply can't meet that threshold anymore. So there's an immediate impact even. And that's where, as you say, Stephen, that's where the uncertainty comes in as well. I think that's the most concerning trend about it all. There's lots to be concerned about if you work in immigration, but for me, I think what I find most challenging is the headline immigration announcement without the detail behind it. And that causes huge problems for everybody, whatever side you're working in, whether you're working in a university advising that student. For us at UKEYS are advising students and universities. For you as employers, it's the big headline grabber without the detail behind it. It's a very problematic trend.
I've just seen a question pop in on that. So the new entrant is somebody new to the labour market, aren't they, with limited experience joining a new role. So they don't have that maximum skilled worker salary visa applied to them.
Yeah, and just to clarify, new entrant will still apply, but we just don't know what the rate will be. That I think that's the gap, the knowledge gap we have at the moment.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Fab. Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. I'm sure we'll come back with more questions as we get into this. As I said at the start, this is a very complex area. I'm going to try without getting into the real nitty gritty of some of these, because like I said, it's it could take us off at tangents, but also means that you get into the realm of sort of legal advice. And I think in my time on this, both as an employer and as in my job at the ISE, that tension between actually what might get announced at a political level, what rules might be put in place, and of course what around discrimination law, which we've already touched on the impact of that. And I've not always seen joined up thinking from government on that. But anyway, that's probably another tangent we'll go down to a bit later. Alison, if I can come to you now, what's the perspective from what you're seeing? Because of course you've got students yourselves as an institution, but you've also got employers as clients. You're running apprentice programs, graduate training programs, all that kind of stuff. So what are the main issues that you're finding at the moment?
So I'm very much echoing what Anne-Marie said. The rule changes are really confusing both for our employers and our students. And also the fact that the proposed rule changes are in place does have a perception that the UK is maybe less friendly place for international students to come along to. And obviously our employers use those students to fill their skills gaps. Some employers are concerned about being able to meet the minimum salary threshold, in particular in the regions. So as we touched upon, the discrimination with certain students, i.e. female students or people that need more support, there is also that suggestion that the regions are going to suffer more because they will not pay the salaries that London employers will pay. So that's something else to put onto the table. And then, as we were just touching upon, this new entrant stroke percentage drop in terms of the minimum salary because there is a lack of clarity around that. I think also coupled with the fact that the government made an announcement not only about the minimum salary threshold, but then also about the changes in terms of the partner visa and the levels that a partner would need in terms of salary to bring somebody into the country. And they then backtracked on that amount and said that there was different amounts coming in at different points in time over the next 2 years, has just thrown this all into a very confusing area. So what we're finding with our employers, in particular, for example, some of the larger firms, they're not too concerned. They think they can meet that threshold. But what they are doing is offering students, but with a caveat that if there are more changes, then they may need to withdraw that offer if the rule change means that it's no longer viable. It also means that employers are reducing reliance upon international students, and they're looking now more towards UK graduates and possibly school leavers as well. So that's another thing to put on the table. And then finally, from a student point of view, the uncertainty around the graduate route is making students wonder if the UK is still a good place to come to in terms of their education.
Yes, I think that's probably worth highlighting as well, of course. I'm sure there's the politics of this, which I think we might get into slightly later into this call, but of course, for international students coming to the UK that higher education relies on, the high fees international students pay when, the fees that a university gets for a UK home student, they've not increased at all really over the last decade or so, definitely not keeping in pace with inflation. That's a real crunch point for education, and actually a few international students coming, if a country, because Australia would like international students, North America would like international students,
Canada,
as a whole, the whole ecosystem in the UK loses out before we even get to individual employers. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Alison?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's all very confusing, very concerning. I mean, we've got a good reputation internationally, and also work with very trusted agents. They're just having to work harder to reassure the students that the UK is still a good place to come to study.
And just go back to that regional point, that's something that we picked up in our conversations, and there's all sorts of implications because, of course, again, just in case anyone on the call doesn't know, that salary threshold is national. It's not sort of weighted by different regional salaries, and that's a problem in itself because we all know, compare London in the southeast to other places, there's differentials. But also, actually, it's interesting. A couple of employers said to me, "Well, of course, employers that whenever we looked at the data from an ISE point of view, roughly." On an average, 10% of graduate programs tend to go to international students, some sectors more than others. But of course, if you're open to recruiting international students, those vacancies could well get filled in London. And actually, I know for lots of organisations, international students are a great help in terms of filling some of those harder to fill regional vacancies. It makes that whole regional piece operationally difficult for employers. That becomes my understanding as well.
Yeah.
Just can you tell me a little about, because we were talking about this just before we went live on the call, apprentices. This came up again on a couple of our employer calls, and this was a new one on me actually, about what are the rules around if an employer uses the apprentice levy to fund their training routes. Actuarials came up on a call. I had to know some of the accountancy routes are done in that way, but if you're an international student taking up an apprenticeship, and if the apprentice levy is going to be used, person needs a visa at the start of their apprentice program that lasts the whole length of that apprentice program, i.e. 2 or 3 years, which again forces those students onto the skilled worker visa route. Am I right in that summary? Because that was a new one on me.
So there's a couple of points on this one, Stephen, and it's again very complicated and confusing. So one is, say for example, an employer has given a skilled worker visa to a person from abroad. They then come to work in that business and say it's a 3-year visa. and they get 1 year in and the employer decides that they want to put them onto an apprenticeship, if that apprenticeship lasts for any time longer than the remainder of the visa, well, then it's a non-runner, because the visa has to last for the whole length of the apprenticeship plus the endpoint assessment. So that's number one, that the employers are hitting this brick wall. And then the other aspect is that they now need to have been resident for 3 years in the country prior to them taking up an apprenticeship. And the student visa does not count towards that 3 years of residency. So it's a bit of a double whammy for some of our employers that do have big apprenticeship programs, but also rely on the international student to fill their graduate programs as well. I don't know if Anne-Marie, you wanted to add anything to that.
I think that's a really good summary of the immigration requirements there, Alison. Yeah, absolutely. It is increasingly challenging because of that complexity and the specificity of the requirements. But I thought that was a really good summary.
Thanks. Georgia, can I come to you now, both with your ISE and your quintet hat on? First of all, is there anything that we haven't really covered yet, you think, that you're hearing on the radar from ISE members in those calls and conversations that we have?
I think just not just the regional piece that Alison brought up there, but also the sector piece as well. So we know some sectors are already paying higher salaries, both in terms of entry, but also when they're going through and coming off programme. But a lot of sectors aren't. So again, this may disproportionately impact certain regions as well as certain sectors in terms of employment, both bringing students into programs, but also onwardly and coming off the program as well if they require, you know, that sponsorship ongoing. So I think that's one piece. I think the second piece is, as you said earlier, a bit about this graduate visa route versus the skilled worker route. And again, the complexities both bringing people in, but also as they come off the program and they start to move forward into their kind of first permanent, if you like, opportunity post those development programs, and how the salary piece is impacting there as well. So some people on this call may be thinking, okay, yeah, I've got the challenge of the new joiners and how we navigate that, but there's also the people that are already with you who are potentially progressing but not at the salary thresholds that they will need to meet that next level of skilled worker sponsorship, if that's what they're going to need in the near future. So I think that's a complexity that's really impacting quite a few people, because they have the dichotomy between, well, we have internal peer groups and benchmarks, and then we have this need to look at doing something potentially differently because of the situation around visa.
I think that's a really good point, Georgia, in terms of, you know, if an employer is thinking, well, okay, there's a minimum salary threshold now, maybe I can up my rates to allow me to take international people, but then they'd have to up the rates for everybody, and that's just not financially viable.
Exactly. And, you know, we know from a lot of employers that a lot of their recruitment is subject to, you know, the swings of the economic climate. And, you know, with people worried about the economic outturns for this year in the UK, we know that the numbers of recruits are sensitive to that. And then you add in this level of not just recruiting, but in existence of employees, groups who are potentially more disadvantaged or impacted. It's a really complex situation, both for those on the recruitment side, but also those supporting the development and progression of students once they're already in the organisation. So yeah, and then with the apprenticeship points that you just made as well, that's adding another layer of complexity, both for students, but also for experienced professionals using the apprenticeship programs for development purposes. So yeah, probably less for this call, but certainly another complexity that I'm certainly seeing with our apprenticeship programs at Quintet.
I suppose the other thing to mention is the shortage occupation list. which is also being reviewed as well, isn't it? So I'm not sure where we are with that one in terms of when that's actually going to be finalised. I think we're talking about April 24.
Yeah, that's quite soon. That because that started pretty much straight away following the ministerial statement. So yeah, we should have that relatively shortly. But of course, what that will turn up, Alison, we don't know. Yeah.
So we don't know which occupations are going to fall off that list, do we? There's uncertainty in that respect as well.
Yeah.
And what routes does that tend to affect in the graduate early career space? Because I tend not to hear our employer members talking particularly about that, and I tend to think about its work in this care sector or the NHS. Is that what that tends to apply to? Or is that a bit of a limited view? Are there much other areas? I think about STEM workers, etc.
Yeah, there's a finite list, isn't there, of lots of different occupations. So it's not just care or health occupations. It does stretch quite a lot wider. And I suppose the question is, how will the government review that? Will they make it a very, very limited list?
Right.
And again, that could link to disproportionate impact on certain sectors, because if there is a marginal change even to that list that then suddenly cuts out a certain proportion of options for certain sectors, that's potentially, with the salary as well, being two barriers for increasing the talent pool through international hiring.
So Georgia, I guess, both again as an recruiter, employer's hat on, but also what we're hearing on the ISE call. How are you dealing with this ambiguity? Because we're not in a situation, as we already said, whereby here's a new set of rules, deal with it, and that can be complicated enough to try to work out what those rules mean. We're actually in a situation where we know change is coming and things are under review halfway through a recruitment season. As you said, there are people on graduate programs at the moment. How do you start to deal with that uncertainty? Because people need to make decisions in the here and now that affect, students as well as employers.
We've sent out, documentation in relation to for our employers to say, look, this is what we know so far. I'm keeping an eye on the Commons Library. There's updates on there. Just to say, like before Christmas, they gave us a certain idea of when things were going to happen. They've now made that a little bit more certain. So we will update our employers again in that respect. I think the other thing to mention, though, which is obviously the elephant in the room, is the forthcoming election. And we don't quite know how that's going to influence the decisions that are going to be made, which is something that nobody can really influence or have any ideas on at the moment.
Yeah, I'll come back to the politics in I do think we need to touch on it. I've got something to say, even if some people might not be able to say it. Georgia, what are you hearing on that question in terms of, yes, as yourselves and what other employers are actually doing to try and manage that ambiguity at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, Alison, it's great to hear that you're sharing so much information with your students and the employers, because that's one area where I think communication is absolutely critical at the moment. So I'm hearing both from members, but also what we're doing at Quintet is just keeping really close to the candidates, if they're candidates, or employees, if they're already here, and just trying to navigate as closely as possible, but being really clear there is so much ambiguity. There's potentially more change to come, whether that's general election or just clarity on the detail of the announcements that we had last year, and just really trying to walk a very fine line between, being open and transparent as we can be, but also keeping them engaged and retained, because ultimately we want them to join if we can make it happen, but equally we are trying not to make false promises, because things may change in a way that we just can't afford or affect that to happen in the end, depending on what happens. And it's a very difficult time, and a lot of anxiety from students surrounding this. Naturally, they were looking forward to joining in September or whatever, and they're very excited to be finishing their degrees or finishing their programs and coming into UK employment. I think it's also very difficult for employers because you're walking a very fine line in terms of recruitment between being seen to be, even if it's not in reality, discriminatory. Ultimately, we have to work with the legislation as it stands today, and it's very difficult to navigate that without potentially creating some form of disadvantage, which of course is then against a lot of other law and legislation in the UK. So I think a lot of employers are really struggling with that. I think legal units, both internally to employers or externally, if they don't have that within their employer, are getting a lot of questions. And I think often the advice is we just have to be really clear what we have today in terms of the rules and the regulations, what we know is being discussed, but until we actually start seeing that clarity coming through in April, July, even, you know, whenever it might be, we just have to keep close to those candidates and just keep the conversation open. It's slightly different for employees because obviously you've got a closer relationship with them, but certainly for the new recruits, those in process or those that have got offers, it's really about keeping that conversation live, keeping it as open and transparent as you can, but equally walking that very fine line that you don't want to raise expectations or for the candidate to assume that you absolutely can do something when actually none of us can say at this stage, depending on the individual circumstances, exactly that can come to bear as maybe we'd have hoped a few months ago when maybe the offer was first extended. It's really tough.
This is where the tension comes, doesn't it? Yeah, I've heard some employers saying they're pausing international student applications, but then of course recruitment carries on. So when you unpause them, your vacancies might be filled, which could also be anti-discriminatory. Again, I don't. This isn't a call where we can give clear answers, I don't think. No. But that challenge is again, it's a very difficult one to get heads around.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the operational challenges, as you mentioned earlier, about regional versus maybe London-centric opportunities, and those pipelines always, you know, London, everyone wants to come to London, and, you know, if you can afford on, you know, the salary thresholds to angle more international talent towards those locations, then you have the challenge of fulfilling the vacancies outside of London, because you may not have the pipeline because you may have paused it, and you may also not have the salary threshold to unpause it when you know that's actually a talent pool you need. So yeah, it's going to be, I think, quite difficult. And again, from an operational perspective, a lot of national employers are probably really struggling at the moment with how to balance that.
And also that knock-on I hear from employers talking about, these are the unintended consequences. So if employers accepting international students, if those students skew towards London, well, actually, when we get into social mobility program, you know, that might force, you know, more vacancies out of the London area, makes it harder people move to travel to. So there's, again, I think that's not one for this call, but there are unintended consequences of this all the way down the sort of the knock-on in terms of yes, the ramifications for all those other vacancies. Anne-Marie, can I just sort of bring you back in at this point? We sort of touched a bit on the politics of this, and one of the questions I've seen come through asking where the 38,500 figure just came from. I mean, this is politics, it's elections wrapped up in this, isn't it? It's everything we know about our current political conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just before I come back on the politics, just to echo what George is saying, certainly from the Careers Advisors Service, we're getting exactly the same. There's really how so much uncertainty across students and how to keep that messaging going and keep them reassured. And people are really running out of you know, really getting stuck on what reassurances to give. I see Emma's question, and I'm happy to come back on that. I think and there's a few in the chat as well about switching as well, so I might speak to that if that's okay as well, Stephen. I think if I'm going to be full and frank on a Monday lunchtime, Emma, I don't think there was really any good justification. It was done in advance of the MAC report. I have shared in the chat a link to the December report from the Migration Advisory Committee, and there are some calculations in there about how the salary threshold might affect net migration, but we're not clear on where the figure came from, and that became even murkier when they sort of backtracked just before Christmas. a little bit in terms of phasing that increased. So there will have been calculations made, but they're probably more political calculations than extensively informed calculations on UK and sectoral salaries. You will have seen that perhaps in the press that there has been particular sensitivities about the care sector roles, about students switching in visas to work in the care sector, which is actually no longer possible. You have to complete your course. That was a policy that the government put in place, and actually we as a sector pushed back on that quite a lot. That switching visas before their completion was completely down to the government, not to student sponsors or anything like that. So that has been cut off, and there are some comments about that in the chat I see. So I think there's still a lot of sensitivity, particularly around the care sector. That is a big political space because, of course, it's also a sector which is very short on staff, is really struggling to fill its vacancies, and it feels like there is not a good solution there for either side. So it is not being looked at as a holistic problem and viewed in that place. So that feels like a real political battleground at the moment. And I think what would be really useful for ISE, for employers, for other employer organisations, is to really get, if you are doing any lobbying and advocacy work in that political space, to think about what the impact of that 38,500 salary is going to have on terms of realistically your starting salaries. Because I think it was Alison that mentioned employers just can't up all of their salaries, that this is just not possible. There are lots of other policies in place, corporation tax, business rates. There are lots of other taxation issues, lots of other policy changes that affect employers, and they just can't keep adding to their bills. There's lots of changes around national insurance, everything, it all adds up. So I think we have to really maybe perhaps as a group push back on really realistically what that salary threshold means for a lot of starting salaries in a lot of sectors. There is a risk politically as well that this government looks at salary as a proxy for quality in terms of graduate job. That is another political football that gets kicked around, and they like to couch it in terms of graduates are being sold, a pup in terms of their education because they can't get a really high salary at the end of it, then it's not a graduate job. But we know that is not the case, because there are sectoral differences that, people are driven by very different career ambitions, and not every graduate will get a very, very high paid role at the start, and it has never been like that. So that is a really difficult political conversation that is being kicked about at the moment, and Number 10 in particular are very keen to use salary as a proxy for quality, and that's something I think that we're all going to have to deal with over the months ahead. One more thing on politics before I stop is I do think we have to be prepared for further changes, and that is not good news for any of you. I think particularly not following on from what George has just said about how you're managing that uncertainty and the communications that you have to manage through that. We are not out of the woods yet. It takes one story, one thing to make the Conservative Party nervous, one thing to make the cabinet nervous, and we could have further changes. And so we can't relax around that, and that's not a very positive thing to say, I know, but it is just something I think we cannot put our guard down, and we have to remain alert to further changes. They may be positive changes, depending on what the MAC reports, but they may also be negative as well.
And we're nowhere near a conversation, are we, around just getting student numbers out of the immigration debate? Because you look at other countries, and at the student recruitment end, they just don't include it, because a big chunk of students don't stay in the UK to work. But my sense is, again, that's just not
political, isn't it, Stephen? That the current government want to show they're going to bring that number down, and they've attacked this whole student area in order to do that. There is obviously the other side of the things, because it was all small boats, wasn't it? And then it all seems to have been put into one pot now, just immigration generally. When a couple of years ago, well, not even a couple years ago, the targets were they wanted 600,000 coming in, and obviously the universities reacted to that very positively. So very lots of mixed messages or flipped messages.
I suspect we're below that target again now, and I think, you know, it is, whether that's still a target for them, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's very difficult to tell how much of a going concern this international education strategy is. But you're right, Alison, that it's all part of a big piece to keep that overall immigration number down. And I would say, you know, as someone that's worked in the sector a long time, student immigration has always been the easiest one to count in and count out. I mean, it was a big ploy of Theresa May's when she was Home Secretary. Even though you know, even George Osborne would push back on that as Chancellor, that this was, you know, this was a no-go. She was adamant, and the reason is it's just the easiest one for them to count in and out, and therefore it's we're so compliant in terms of student immigration, we're so on top of it. They just can't get a handle on the small boats or asylum or however you want to phrase it, and therefore they're just trying to focus on the stuff they have got a handle on, and perhaps not thinking about the long term or even the short term consequences of that policy change.
One thing I would actually say also, I think more to the advantage of our university listeners, of course, is that employers also receive applications from international students who are studying abroad, live abroad, nothing to do with the UK institution. So that actually when those of you in career services are thinking about employers, you know, the applications they get with, I think it's fair to say, Georgia, that actually probably as a result of the pandemic, it's even easier for somebody actually based abroad to apply to the UK. And of course, they're in the mix, and also in the mix on the visa debate as well.
That's absolutely true. I think from a recruiter perspective, though, it's easier to not be discriminatory when you decline to progress an applicant who's not already based in the UK or doesn't already have right to work. It, however, is not the full stop of that story, but yes, absolutely, you do have a much easier way for people anywhere in the world to apply for jobs these days, and often, you know, are also very suitable for a number of different graduate positions that employers are offering in the UK. But it is an added complication in terms of recruitment, but yeah, those that are already studying in the UK, I think they're the population that employers tend to find the most complicated on the basis of right to work and all the other usually kind of initial screening items that employers will be looking at in terms of whether they can progress a candidate or not. And also with costs and budgets being scrutinised, you know, relocation packages, things like that, they're often not on offer. So again, you know, we often see international students outside of the UK deselecting themselves when they realise that actually the overall costs to come to the UK to take up an opportunity probably wouldn't work, even if they could make that actual transition.
Right. I'm conscious of time actually, so I'm also been having a flick through the chat and the Q&A. So lots of really great comments and postings and sort of people helping each other out in true ISE true ISE community spirit. One of the questions actually was recently by Amy, was around employers who's got people on a graduate route, you know, the visa finishing before their program's expired. Yeah, sorry, do you want to say something like that, Georgia?
I was just seeing that as well, and I was just going to pick up on that, and I think somebody's actually just responded. Again, we really see a lot of employers in the membership saying that the reason they recruit graduates permanently and on the skilled worker visa is because the graduate visa route just doesn't work. Most programs don't neatly fit into the 2 years post graduation that the grad visa offers. And then obviously with the additional review, we also don't know if that's going to create more limitations in terms of its applicability. But yes, most employers opt for the highly skilled route on the very basis that it just doesn't suit their needs, whether it be the program tenure or whether it be just the onward retention post program. Or indeed some employers aren't using programs at all. You just go into a graduate position from day one. So again, you want to secure that individual just as you would do any other type of employee who's joining you, which is difficult when the graduate visa route is obviously there in an attempt to bridge an employment from education, transition for international students, but the timelines very often don't work.
Whenever like I said, it's hard to get accurate data on all employers, but every time we ask questions like this from an IC perspective, the split tends to be 50-50. 50% of vacancies are filled, they put people on the graduate visa route and then transition off those at some point during the development program. But actually lots of employers get the skilled worker straight away for exactly those points, or they use the graduate route when there's a little bit of difficulty getting people on board, or the technical issues get in the way, and then switch to the skilled worker visa. Again, we should caveat this. This is ISE employers that tend to be larger employers, tend to have HR teams. That's a very different market to those of you on the call who might be dealing with SME type organisations that don't have access to the same kind of resources, and the challenges I think are even greater in there, both for students and employers, in just trying to navigate what's happening out there. I mean, it's worth mentioning, is it, Anne-Marie, the guide to employers and students that the ISE has helped produce, because that is a very useful document. We've got links to that on our website.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just going to mention that, and I'll post it again in the chat before we drop out. But it is really useful, and I think one of the other things as well that we've been doing as a group is for those employers that are moving people from the graduate route to skilled worker route is still continuing to advocate for that switch, for that any fee cost to be minimised, because obviously there is a slightly different fee charge from moving from student route to skilled worker than there is for graduate route, and we think that's an oversight rather than a deliberate policy decision. So we're still trying to get that unpicked. I think it is about making things clearer. It's clear from the comments that there's some really, really great practice and real commitment from employers across the board, but really having to navigate all of that uncertainty is really, really, really tough. And I'll also post some information on the UKISA website in general around working after studies and immigration as well, that some may find it, although it's aimed primarily at advising students, you may find it useful.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm just seeing small comments that are coming through, and I'm seeing your point, Claire. And I think again, it's something that I've seen from my experience is the conversations that happen internally with organisations. Some of the decisions that organisations take are risk-based because it is interpretation of the legal position around discriminatory behaviour, what you might do, or what the implications might be. So I think lots of employers have said to us it's a challenge dealing with immigration teams once you're away from actually the hard and fast rules around salary thresholds, etc., how you deal with different candidates in different situations, different roles, etc. I'm conscious of time. We covered loads of ground, so thanks. This is great, and I apologise to all our audience. I did say at the start there are lots of issues here where there are no clear answers. So as the situation changes through the year, for better or worse, we will keep coming back to this subject to at least provide a forum to air some of the knowledge that's out there, some of the solutions that might be, but even if it just gives you information to take back to your students or back to your colleagues at work and say, actually, some of these things people don't have an answer. We're trying to navigate through. But wonderful panelists. Is there anything that we've missed? You don't think anything you thought that we should have touched on this conversation, but haven't got round to yet? take silences and no. Jolly good. Thank you very much. Excellent. I really appreciate you taking your time, Anne-Marie, Alison, and Georgia, to come onto the webinar and talk about this. As I said, it's a challenge when there aren't clear answers to a lot of the things that we're trying to deal with as a sector. And as I said, we will keep coming back to this throughout the year. So thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated for sharing your advice and pearls of wisdom. Lots of links in the chat. As I said at the start, this has been recorded. You will get a link to the recording that you'll go back to. We will be producing a summary blog on this that we'll publish over the next week or so on the ISE Insights Hub. And then as we get more and more information coming through, we will, as I said, keep coming back to this. So thank you very much for all your help, everybody. Thanks for everybody for taking part. Thanks for everybody for being an active participant on the chat and the Q&A. It's been great to see. Enjoy the rest of your Monday and the rest of the week, and talk to you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Stephen.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.